My brother mocked me for being broke, but I quietly bought his luxury car. The mashed potatoes were still steaming when my brother decided to destroy me. Jess, you still driving that Corolla? Brandon's voice cut through the warm chatter of our family's Thanksgiving dinner like a blade through butter. Thought you'd at least have upgraded to Uber by now. The dining room fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then came the laughter. Nervous giggles from my cousins, a full belly laugh from Uncle Mike, and that painful forced chuckle from Mom that meant she was trying to keep the peace. Again. I kept my fork steady as I pushed sweet potato casserole around my plate, forcing my face into what I hoped looked like an amused smile. Still gets me from point A to point B? I said lightly, though my chest felt like someone had just punched all the air out of it. Barely, Brandon continued, clearly enjoying his audience. He leaned back in his chair, the chair at the head of the table that somehow always became his, even though this was Mom's house, and grinned. I saw you at the gas station last week. That thing was making sounds like a dying walrus. More laughter. Aunt Susan nearly choked on her wine. Brandon, Mom warned, but her voice had no real bite in it. It never did when it came to her golden boy.
What?
I'm just saying, sis could use some financial advice. I mean, look at this place. He gestured around Mom's modest dining room with its outdated wallpaper and the same furniture she'd had since I was 12. Some of us have moved up in the world. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Brandon had money. Brandon had success. Brandon had the luxury downtown condo, the designer clothes, and the silver Porsche 911 Carrera S that he'd somehow worked into every conversation for the past 2 years. And me? I was just broke little Jess, still living in a rental apartment, still driving a 10-year-old Toyota, still single at 28 because apparently successful men weren't interested in women who couldn't afford to split the check at fancy restaurants. At least, that's what everyone thought. Speaking of moving up, my cousin Tyler said, clearly trying to change the subject, that car of yours is incredible, Brandon. What did that run you again? Brandon's chest puffed up like a peacock. 130. But honestly, when you're making the kind of deals I'm making, it's really an investment. Image matters in my business. I nodded along with everyone else, making the appropriate impress sounds while privately wondering how someone could spend more on a car than most people made in 2 years. But then again, Brandon had always been flashy. Even as kids, he'd been the one showing off his new sneakers while I quietly did my homework in secondhand clothes. The conversation moved on to his latest business venture, something involving tech startups and venture capital that he explained in just enough detail to sound impressive without actually saying anything specific. I'd heard variations of this pitch before. Brandon was always working on something big, always on the verge of his next breakthrough. The market's been challenging, he was saying, cutting into his turkey with surgical precision, but that's when the real players separate themselves from the wannabes. You have to be willing to leverage everything to get to the next level. Uncle Mike raised his beer. That's the American dream right there. I excused myself to help Mom clear the dishes, grateful for an escape from the Brandon show. In the kitchen, she gave me one of those looks, the one that said she was sorry but also powerless to change anything. He doesn't mean anything by it, honey, she said quietly, scraping plates. You know how he gets when he's excited about work. I nodded, because what else could I do? Tell her that her precious son had been making jokes about my finances since we were teenagers? That every family gathering felt like a performance where I played the role of the struggling younger sister so Brandon could shine brighter? I know, Mom. But as I loaded the dishwasher, I could hear him in the dining room, telling everyone about his latest business trip to Miami, the 5-star hotel, the client dinner that cost more than I supposedly made in a month. The thing was, Brandon wasn't entirely wrong about the money part. He did make more than me on paper. What he didn't know was that I'd been working. Not the kind of flashy look-at-me work that he did, but real work. Quiet work. For the past 3 years, I'd been freelance consulting for high-net-worth individuals who needed someone discreet to manage their financial portfolios. People who valued intelligence over image, results over reputation. It had started almost by accident. I'd been working at a small accounting firm when one of our clients, a tech executive's wife, mentioned she needed help organizing her investments. Her husband was too busy to deal with it, and she didn't trust the big firms with their pushy salespeople and hidden fees. One client led to another. Word of mouth in wealthy circles travels fast, especially when you're good at what you do and know how to keep your mouth shut. I didn't advertise. I didn't have a fancy office or expensive suits. I just made my clients' money grow, quietly and efficiently. My little Corolla might not look like much, but the checking account it was paid for would have made Brandon's eyes water. I was drawing a wine glass when I heard his phone ring. He stepped onto Mom's back porch to take the call, probably thinking he was being polite. But Mom's kitchen window was cracked open, and Brandon had never been good at controlling his volume when he was stressed. "No, I can't move the payment up," he was saying, his voice tight. "We agreed on the timeline. Yes, I understand the market volatility, but the collateral is solid. The car alone is worth more than the principal." I froze, glass in hand. Collateral? Car? Look, I just need another 60 days. 90 at most. The series of funding is basically guaranteed, and then I can pay everything off plus interest. What do you mean, review the terms? The Porsche isn't going anywhere. It's not like I'm going to default. My heart started beating faster. Brandon was using his precious car as collateral for some kind of loan? The same car he'd just been bragging about to the entire family?
Fine.
Yes, I'll have my lawyer review the documentation. But this is just a formality, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I'll call you Monday. The back door slammed shut, and Brandon walked back into the dining room like nothing had happened. But I caught a glimpse of his face as he passed the kitchen, jaw tight, eyes worried. That wasn't the expression of a man on top of the world. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I smiled and nodded and played my part, but my mind was racing. Brandon had leveraged his car, which meant his business wasn't going as well as he claimed, which meant his whole image, his whole superiority complex, was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. As I drove home in my supposedly pathetic Corolla, paid for in cash, no loan required, I couldn't stop thinking about that phone call. About the way Brandon's voice had cracked just slightly when he'd said the word default. He'd spent 2 years mocking my modest lifestyle while secretly living on credit. But here's the thing about working with high net worth individuals: you learn things. You learn how money really works, how debts get traded and sold, how private lending operates in the shadows of the traditional banking system. You learn that sometimes, if you know the right people and you have the right resources, you can make very interesting things happen. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in my car for a moment, watching the windows light up in the building across the street. Families settling in for the evening, probably digesting their own Thanksgiving meals and family drama. Brandon thought I was broke. Brandon thought I was unsuccessful. Brandon thought he could use me as his personal punchline whenever he needed to feel better about himself. Brandon had no idea what he'd just handed me. I locked my car and walked up to my modest apartment, but my mind was already working, already planning. That seed of an idea he'd planted with his phone call was starting to grow, and I had a feeling it was going to bloom into something beautiful. Something he'd never see coming. Something that would teach him the most important lesson he'd never learned. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They're usually the ones who end up surprising you. The first rule of working with wealthy people's money is that everyone talks, but only to the right people in the right places at the right time. I spent my Monday morning doing something Brandon would have called broke person research, sitting in a coffee shop with my laptop, using the free Wi-Fi to dig into the financial underworld of private lending. But this wasn't desperate Googling. This was surgical investigation. I started with the fragments I'd overheard from his call. Market volatility. Series of funding. Collateral review. These weren't terms you'd hear from a traditional bank. This was private wealth territory, the kind of lending that happened between boutique firms and cash-strapped entrepreneurs who needed money fast and couldn't wait for traditional approval processes. 3 hours and 4 lattes later, I found them. Meridian Capital Partners, a private wealth management firm specializing in alternative lending solutions for high-growth ventures. Their website was all sleek fonts and stock photos of handshakes, but I recognized the language. These were the people who loaned money to startups using everything from intellectual property to luxury assets as collateral. The funny thing about recognition? Sometimes it goes both ways. I stared at their address on East 57th Street, and suddenly I was 25 again, sitting in their glass conference room wearing my best interview suit, being told I was overqualified for their junior analyst position. The hiring manager, a woman named Patricia Morse, had been impressed with my credentials but concerned about my cultural fit. Translation: I wasn't flashy enough for their client base. "We need people who can relate to our clientele," she'd explained delicately. "People who understand the lifestyle our borrowers are trying to maintain." I'd walked out of that office, knowing I'd dodged a bullet. Now, 3 years later, I was beginning to think I'd dodged it straight into the perfect position. I closed my laptop and made a call. "Meridian Capital. How may I direct your call?" "Patricia Morse, please. This is regarding a potential investment opportunity." The hold music was Mozart. Of course it was. Patricia Morse speaking. "Ms. Morse, this is Jessica Chun from Aurora Holdings LLC. I understand your firm handles private bridge lending with alternative collateral structures." There was a pause. In the world of private wealth, nobody called out of the blue unless they had serious money or serious connections. I was counting on that assumption. "Yes, we do. Are you looking to structure a loan, or are you interested in our investment opportunities?" Bingo. Investment opportunities meant they sold their loan positions to third parties. Exactly what I'd hoped. Investment opportunities. I'm particularly interested in asset-backed positions. Luxury vehicles specifically. Another pause. Longer this time. That's quite specific. Most of our investors prefer diversified portfolios. I have specific expertise in luxury automotive markets. I'm looking for positions where the underlying collateral matches my knowledge base. It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd learned plenty about car values from my clients who collected vintage Ferraris and McLarens like trading cards. I see. Well, we do occasionally have opportunities for qualified investors to purchase loan positions, particularly in cases where we prefer to minimize our exposure to individual borrowers. What kind of investment capacity are we discussing? This was the moment. The question that would either open doors or slam them shut. 200,000 liquid for the right opportunity. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. "I think we should meet in person. Are you available this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I was back in that same glass conference room, but this time wearing a different armor. Gone was the eager job applicant. In her place sat the managing partner of Aurora Holdings LLC, a shell company I'd created 3 years ago to manage my consulting income and investments. Patricia looked exactly the same, except now she was treating me like I mattered. "We do have one position that might interest you," she said, sliding a folder across the mahogany table. "A bridge loan secured by a 2022 Porsche 911 Carrera S. The borrower is experiencing some cash flow challenges with his startup, and frankly, his communication has been difficult." I opened the folder, keeping my expression neutral even as my heart rate spiked. There it was. Brandon's loan agreement. $120,000 borrowed against his $130,000 car. The interest rate was brutal, 18% annually. The term was 6 months, with the option to extend for additional fees. "What kind of communication difficulties?" I asked. "The type that suggests he may not fully understand the terms of his agreement. He seems to think this is a traditional auto loan with traditional protections. It's not." I studied the paperwork. Brandon had signed this 2 months ago, which meant he had 4 months left. But there were acceleration clauses, triggers that would allow Meridian to call in the full debt immediately under certain circumstances. What would it cost to purchase this position? $90,000. You'd assume the loan at face value, plus our handling fee. If the borrower defaults, the collateral is yours. If he pays, you collect the principal plus interest. $90,000. I had it. Not easily, but I had it. 3 years of careful investing and client fees, sitting in accounts that Brandon would never imagine existed. "I'll need to review the documentation overnight," I said. Patricia smiled. "Of course. But I should mention, we've had other inquiries about this position. The automotive market is quite strong right now." I stood up, shaking her hand with exactly the right amount of confidence. "I'll have an answer for you by tomorrow morning." As I walked out of that building, past the doorman, who probably made more than most people thought I did, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. Not the loud, showy power that Brandon wielded like a club. This was different. This was the quiet power of preparation meeting opportunity, of being underestimated by everyone except the people who mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Hope you had a good day, honey." Brandon said his business is doing really well. I smiled and kept walking. Brandon had no idea his business was about to become my business. I was supposed to be reviewing quarterly reports for Mrs. Patterson's portfolio when everything changed. Instead, I found myself staring at my kitchen table, which had become command central for what I'd started thinking of as Operation Karma. Spread across the surface were copies of Brandon's loan documents, Meridian Capital's transfer paperwork, and my own banking statements showing the $90,000 wire transfer that had gone through 3 days ago. Officially, I was now the proud owner of one very expensive debt secured by one very familiar silver Porsche. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but I couldn't bring myself to get up and make a fresh cup. Every few minutes, I'd check my phone, waiting for the message I knew was coming. Patricia had warned me that they moved fast once a position was transferred. "We don't like to give borrowers time to lawyer up or hide assets," she'd explained during our final meeting. "Clean, quick, professional. That's how we maintain our reputation." The loan documents made for fascinating reading. Brandon had violated 3 separate clauses in the past month alone. He'd missed a required insurance payment. He'd taken the car out of state without notification. Most importantly, he defaulted on a progress report about his startup's funding status. Any one of those violations gave the lender, now me, the right to accelerate the loan and demand immediate payment in full. My phone buzzed at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Asset recovered. Title will be released within 5 business days. Thank you for your business. Meridian Recovery Services. I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it 3 times to make sure it was real. Then I set the phone down very carefully, walked to my kitchen window, and looked out at my little Corolla sitting in the parking lot. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt hollow, like I'd just watched something break that could never be put back together. My phone rang 20 minutes later.
Mom.
"Jess, honey, have you heard from your brother today?" I kept my voice steady. "No, why?" "He's been calling me all afternoon, but I was at the grocery store and missed his calls." He sounded upset in his voicemails. Something about his car. His car. I don't know the details. You know how he gets when he's stressed about work. Could you maybe give him a call? He might talk to you. The irony was suffocating. "Sure, Mom. I'll reach out." But I didn't call Brandon. Instead, I did something much more interesting. I waited. By 6 p.m., the stories started emerging on social media like a slow-motion car crash. First came the Instagram story from Brandon's friend Marcus, posted from what looked like a downtown restaurant. "Bro just watched the most insane repo situation outside Blackstone Steakhouse. Dude came out to valet, and his Porsche was getting loaded onto a flatbed. Wild." Then came Brandon's own posts, a carefully curated sequence of rage and deflection. Facebook, 6:23 p.m. Sometimes in business, you deal with dishonorable people who don't understand what a partnership means. Legal action is being considered. Instagram, 6:31 p.m. A photo of a whiskey glass with the caption, "When jealous competitors try to play dirty, you handle it like a professional." Real recognizes real. Twitter, 6:45 p.m. Funny how some people think they can intimidate successful entrepreneurs. They clearly don't know who they're dealing with. I screenshotted each one, not because I needed evidence, but because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment Brandon's carefully constructed image started cracking in real time. But it was the Instagram live video at 7:15 p.m. that really got to me. There was my brother, sitting in what looked like the bar at Blackstone Steakhouse, still in his expensive suit but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. His voice had that too loud quality of someone who'd had a few drinks and was trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I want to set the record straight about what happened today," he was saying to his phone camera. "Some opportunistic vultures tried to make a move on my assets, thinking they could catch me off guard. But here's the thing about being a real entrepreneur, you always have backup plans. He took a sip of his drink. The car situation is temporary. Just some paperwork issues with a bridging loan while we close our Series A. Anyone who knows anything about startup financing understands this is completely normal. Normal.
Right.
The funny thing is, he continued, and I could see the anger creeping into his voice despite his attempts to stay cool. Whoever bought this debt probably thinks they're some kind of genius. Like they really got one over on me. But they have no idea what they just walked into. He leaned closer to the camera. See, I know exactly who's behind this. And when I find out which bottom feeder bought my loan, they're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person. The live stream ended abruptly. I set my phone down and finally made that fresh cup of coffee. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was normal. I felt nothing, which was strange because I'd expected to feel something big in this moment.
Satisfaction, maybe.
Or guilt. Or at least excitement. Instead, I just felt tired. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the parking lot where my modest Corolla sat next to Mrs. Henderson's Honda and the college kid's beaten-up Ford. Normal cars for normal people living normal lives. I wasn't normal people anymore, though. I was the person who just repossessed her brother's pride and joy, and he had no idea. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. I finally talked to Brandon. He says someone stole his car.
Can you believe it?
He's filing a police report. I typed back. That's terrible. I hope they catch whoever did it. Then I deleted the message and typed instead, wow, that's crazy. Is he okay? Because that was the thing about lying. It had to be believable, even to yourself. Especially to yourself. The car arrived on a Friday morning at 8:47 a.m. I was ready for it, waiting in the parking lot of Premier Auto Storage on the outskirts of town. The facility looked like what it was, a place where wealthy people kept their toys when they didn't have garage space. Classic Mustangs, vintage Corvettes, and the occasional Ferrari, all tucked away behind climate-controlled doors until their owners wanted to play. The flatbed truck pulled up with Brandon's silver Porsche 911 Carrera S strapped down like a captured beast. Even dirty and slightly disheveled from its forced removal, it was beautiful. I could see why Brandon had been so proud of it, why he'd worked it into every conversation for 2 years. You Miss Chen? The driver was a weathered man in coveralls who looked like he'd repossessed everything from boats to private jets. Got your paperwork right here. I signed the forms with a steady hand, though my stomach was doing complicated gymnastics. When the car rolled off the truck and sat there in the morning sunlight, keys dangling from the driver's ignition, I felt like I was looking at evidence of a crime I'd committed. Except it wasn't a crime. It was business. Legal, documented, perfectly legitimate business. She's all yours, the driver said, handing me a manila envelope. Title's in there, along with the spare key and the owner's manual. Previous owner kept good records. Previous owner. Not Brandon. Not my brother. Just some anonymous previous owner who'd failed to meet his obligations. After the truck left, I sat in the driver's seat for exactly 5 minutes. The interior still smelled like Brandon's expensive cologne, something woody and aggressive that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payment. The leather was perfect, unmarked. The dashboard gleamed. Every surface screamed money and success, and look at me confidence. It felt like sitting inside Brandon's ego. I drove it exactly 6 blocks to Elite Auto Detailing, where I'd made an appointment under Aurora Holdings, LLC. I wanted every trace of Brandon removed from this car. Every fingerprint, every scent, every molecule of his presence scrubbed away until it was just a machine again. Full service detail, I told the manager. Interior, exterior, engine bay. I want it perfect. Yes, ma'am. We'll have her looking showroom fresh. While they worked, I walked to the coffee shop next door and called Premier Auto Storage. I need to rent a space. Long-term. Climate-controlled. How long-term are we talking? Indefinite. 3 hours later, the Porsche looked like it had just rolled off the dealer lot. Every surface gleamed. The interior smelled like leather conditioning and new car scent. It was flawless. And I hated it. Not the car itself. The car was magnificent. I hated what it represented. The weight of what I'd done. The secret I was now carrying. The way it made me feel powerful and sick at the same time. I drove it to the storage facility and parked it in Unit 247, a space barely larger than the car itself, but perfectly climate-controlled and secure. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a long moment. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out something I'd bought that morning, a small velvet jewelry box, the kind used for engagement rings. I placed both sets of keys inside, closed the lid, and held it in my palm. Physical proof of what I'd accomplished, what I'd taken, what I owned. I locked the storage unit and drove home in my Corolla, the velvet box in my purse like a secret heartbeat. That night, I watched Brandon's digital meltdown from the comfort of my modest couch. Instagram, 9:23 p.m., a photo of his reflection in a storefront window, captioned, "When you're building an empire, small minds try to tear you down, but diamonds are made under pressure." Facebook, 10:45 p.m. Interesting how quickly fake friends disappear when you're dealing with business challenges. Taking notes for the future. Twitter, 11:18 p.m. Some people confuse temporary setbacks with permanent failure. Those people have never built anything worth keeping. But it was the LinkedIn post that really showed me how much this was eating at him. Fellow entrepreneurs, be careful who you trust with sensitive financial information. Sometimes competitors disguise themselves as partners. Always read the fine print and keep your assets protected. Hard lesson learned. The comments were telling. His usual supporters were offering generic encouragement, but I could read between the lines. People were starting to wonder. In Brandon's world, image was everything, and his image was developing cracks. The velvet box sat on my kitchen table like a shrine to my own moral ambiguity. I hadn't told Mom. I couldn't. She'd called twice that weekend to check on the car situation, and each time I'd made sympathetic noises while Brandon's keys sat 6 feet away from me. "He seems to be handling it well," she'd said. "You know your brother. Nothing keeps him down for long." If only she knew that Brandon wasn't handling anything. He was drowning, and I was the one holding him underwater. Sunday morning brought a new development. I was drinking coffee and scrolling through social media when I saw it, a photo posted by Marcus, Brandon's friend from the restaurant. It showed Brandon at what looked like a Lexus dealership, standing next to a black sedan with the caption, "When life gives you lemons, you get a reliable ride and keep grinding. Respect." A Lexus. Brandon had gone from a $130,000 Porsche to a Lexus sedan. I felt something twist in my chest that might have been satisfaction or might have been guilt. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. The velvet box seemed to pulse with significance every time I walked past it. Sometimes I'd pick it up and hold it, feeling the weight of those keys, the weight of what they represented. I owned my brother's pride. I owned his most prized possession. I owned the symbol of everything he thought made him better than me. And he had no idea. The not knowing was the real punishment. That's what made this different from simple revenge. Brandon could have handled a confrontation. He could have handled anger or accusations, or even public humiliation. But uncertainty? The gnawing question of who had done this to him and why? That was eating him alive, one passive-aggressive social media post at a time. And I was going to let it. The invitation arrived in my email on a Tuesday morning, forwarded from one of my most lucrative clients. "Jessica, thought you might enjoy this networking event. Premium automotive, high net worth individuals, good connections. Let me know if you'd like to attend as my guest. Charles." Charles Whitman was a tech executive whose portfolio I'd been managing for 8 months. He collected vintage Porsches the way other people collected stamps, and he'd mentioned wanting to introduce me to other automotive enthusiasts who might need financial consulting services. The event details made my coffee taste bitter. An evening of excellence, luxury automotive networking reception, hosted by Brandon Chun, entrepreneur and automotive enthusiast. Location, Stuttgart Motor Cars, Downtown Gallery. Black tie optional. Brandon was throwing a networking party at the very dealership where he'd bought his Porsche 2 years ago. The same Porsche that was currently sitting in storage unit 247, waiting patiently for me to decide what to do with it. I stared at the invitation for 10 minutes, reading Brandon's name over and over. He was using his automotive enthusiast credentials to network, probably trying to rebuild his image after the repossession. In his world, confidence was currency, and he was clearly trying to spend freely. I forwarded my acceptance to Charles. Then I went shopping. The dress was charcoal gray silk, cut with the kind of understated elegance that whispered money without screaming it. The shoes were Italian leather, expensive, but not flashy. The jewelry was minimal, thin gold chain, small diamond studs, a vintage Cartier watch that had belonged to my grandmother. I looked like what I'd become, someone who understood wealth but didn't need to announce it. Charles picked me up in his pristine 1988 Porsche 911 Turbo, painted in classic Guards red. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, silver-haired and genuinely kind, the type of client who treated me like a trusted advisor rather than hired help. "I think you'll enjoy this crowd," he said as we pulled up to Stuttgart Motor Cars. A mix of collectors, entrepreneurs, and people who appreciate fine engineering. The dealership had been transformed for the evening. Soft lighting highlighted the showroom's collection of gleaming sports cars, and servers in black uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The space hummed with the particular energy of successful people making connections. I spotted Brandon immediately. He was holding court near a silver 911. Not his old one, obviously, but similar enough to make me wonder if the choice was deliberate. He looked good, I had to admit. Sharp black suit, confident posture, that million-dollar smile that had charmed teachers and employers and probably investors throughout his life. He was telling a story that involved dramatic hand gestures and had his audience laughing. Same old Brandon, turning every conversation into a performance with himself as the star. "Charles Whitman," my client said, approaching the group with me beside him. "Brandon, wonderful event. I'd like you to meet my financial advisor, Jessica Chin." The moment Brandon saw me, his face went through several expressions in rapid succession.
Surprise.
Confusion. A flicker of something that might have been panic. Then, like watching a computer reboot, his public smile clicked back into place. "Jess? What are you? What a surprise to see you here." "Hello, Brandon." I kept my voice pleasant and professional. "Charles invited me. Beautiful venue." Charles looked between us with interest. "You two know each other?" "Jessica is my sister," Brandon said, and I caught the slight emphasis on the word, like he was marking territory, establishing his version of our relationship for the room. "How wonderful," Charles said warmly. "I had no idea. Jessica has been instrumental in reorganizing my automotive investment portfolio. Brilliant mind for financial strategy." Brandon's smile faltered for just a moment. In his world, I was broke little Jess with a dying Corolla. Having a client like Charles, a man whose car collection was worth more than most houses, complicated that narrative. The conversation continued around us, but I could feel Brandon's attention like heat. He kept glancing at me, trying to reconcile the woman in the expensive dress talking knowledgeably about automotive markets with his mental image of his struggling younger sister. I was discussing depreciation curves on limited edition Ferraris with a collector named Margaret when the moment came. "Speaking of interesting acquisitions," said an older gentleman named Robert, joining our circle with a crystal tumbler in hand, "I heard through the grapevine about that repo situation last month. Porsche 911, silver, practically new. Got picked up for a song by some LLC with a female managing partner." The circle went quiet for just a second too long. "Repo?" Margaret asked with the kind of delighted curiosity that wealthy people reserved for other people's financial misfortunes. "Oh yes," Robert continued, warming to his story. "Friend of mine at Meridian Capital mentioned it. Borrower thought he was untouchable, you know the type. Young entrepreneur, probably thought the lender wouldn't dare call in the debt. But the woman who bought the position? Brilliant move. Paid $90,000 for a loan secured by a car worth $130,000. I felt Brandon stare like a physical weight. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him standing very still, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. "Female managing partner, you said?" Charles asked conversationally. "That's right." LLC called Aurora Holdings, I believe. The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Margaret laughed. Well, whoever she is, she knows her business. I smiled and raised my champagne glass slightly. The automotive market can be very rewarding for the right investor. Brandon's face had gone the color of old paper. If you'll excuse me, I said pleasantly, I should step outside for some air. Charles, shall I meet you by the valet? I walked away without looking back, feeling Brandon's realization burning between my shoulder blades like a laser. Outside in the cool evening air, I handed my valet ticket to the attendant and waited for Charles's pristine Porsche to appear. Through the dealership's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Brandon still standing in the same spot, staring at the space where I'd been. He knew. Finally, completely, absolutely, he knew. I didn't go home after the party. Instead, I drove Charles's Porsche to my apartment, said goodnight to my gracious client, and climbed into my little Corolla. But I didn't start the engine. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, watching the windows in my building light up as neighbors settled in for the evening, thinking about what I was about to do. The velvet box was waiting on my kitchen table where I'd left it, like a small altar to my own transformation. I picked it up, felt the weight of those keys one more time, and slipped it into my purse. Premier Auto Storage was quiet at 9:30 p.m., just security lights and shadows between the rows of climate-controlled units. I'd called ahead for an extra fee. They provided after-hours access for owners who wanted to visit their stored vehicles. Unit 247 opened with a soft mechanical hum. There it sat, exactly as I'd left it 3 weeks ago. Brandon's silver Porsche 911 Carrera S, detailed to perfection, waiting in the artificial twilight like a sleeping animal. I pulled the keys from the velvet box and slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over with a purr that cost more than most people's annual salary. Every surface was exactly as I remembered, premium leather, brushed aluminum, the kind of craftsmanship that justified 6-figure price tags. But it didn't smell like Brandon's cologne anymore. It smelled like leather conditioner and possibility. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, and realized something had changed. The guilt that had been gnawing at me for weeks was gone. In its place was something cleaner, simpler. Closure. I backed out of the storage unit and drove toward the exit. The security guard barely looked up as I passed through the gate, just another wealthy person playing with their expensive toy. But as I turned onto the main road, I made a decision that surprised even me. I didn't drive home. I drove downtown. It was a Thursday night, which meant the city's professional crowd would be out at their usual haunts. Places like Blackstone Steakhouse, where Brandon had been eating when his car was repossessed. Places where image mattered and being seen mattered even more. I found a parking space 2 blocks from Blackstone and walked the rest of the way in my heels, my apartment keys in one hand and the Porsche key fob in the other. Through the restaurant's windows, I could see the usual crowd of suits and expensive dresses, people conducting business over $100 steaks and $50 cocktails. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I just stood there for a moment, visible through the glass if anyone cared to look, then walked back to the car. The drive through downtown was leisurely, almost meditative. Past the financial district where I'd first learned about private lending. Past the coffee shop where I'd researched Meridian Capital. Past the building where I'd been told I wasn't the right cultural fit for their world. I pulled up to a red light next to a black Lexus sedan. The driver looked over, probably drawn by the distinctive silhouette of the 911. Our eyes met through 2 layers of glass, and I watched Brandon's face cycle through recognition, disbelief, and something that might have been respect. The light turned green. I didn't accelerate dramatically or rev the engine or make any kind of show. I just drove. Smoothly, confidently, like I'd been driving cars worth more than houses my entire life. In my rearview mirror, I saw the Lexus pull over to the side of the road. By the time I got home, my phone had 3 missed calls from Brandon. No voicemails. No texts. Just the evidence that he'd tried to reach me and thought better of it. What was he going to say? That I'd stolen his car? We both knew the law was on my side. That I'd been dishonest? We both knew I'd never lied to him about anything. That I'd betrayed family loyalty? We both knew he'd spent years treating me like a punchline. The truth was simpler and more devastating than any accusation he could make. I'd beaten him at his own game using rules he'd never bothered to learn. I parked the Porsche in my modest apartment complex, where it looked hilariously out of place among the Hondas and Toyotas. My neighbors would probably think I was having some kind of midlife crisis or dating someone with more money than sense. Let them think whatever they wanted. I'd learned the value of being underestimated. Inside my apartment, I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, looking at the empty space where the velvet box had lived for 3 weeks. The keys were on my counter now, ordinary metal and plastic that unlocked something extraordinary. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Brandon said he saw you downtown tonight. He seemed excited that you two are finally connecting more. I smiled and typed back. Yeah, we ran into each other. It was nice. Because that's what this was in the end.
Nice. Clean.
Complete. Brandon would never admit publicly what had happened. His pride wouldn't allow it. He'd have to live with the knowledge that his little sister, broke, unsuccessful, driving a Corolla Jess, had outmaneuvered him so completely that he couldn't even complain about it. Every time he saw me at family gatherings, he'd remember. Every time someone mentioned Aurora Holdings or Meridian Capital or private lending, he'd remember. Every time he made a joke about someone else's financial situation, he'd remember. And he'd never say a word. That was the beauty of it. The most devastating victories weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet ones that lived in the spaces between words, in the things everyone knew but nobody could say. I finished my tea, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Tomorrow, I drive my new car to work and get back to the business of making money for people smart enough to trust me with it. Tonight, I was just a woman who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't a dish served cold. Sometimes it's a dish served in complete, elegant silence.